Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. Now we'll continue our reading and discussion of the book The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, page 636 if you're following along. Yesterday we were talking about the early councils of the Roman Catholic Church and how none of them supported this idea of papal infallibility. The Pope can insists that he is infallible and divine, but it was not recognized by the early councils of the Roman Catholic Church, and it was an area of tremendous frustration for the papacy, always trying to assert its temporal and spiritual power, its infallible power on the world. And beginning with the first full sentence on page 636, the author says this: "True to the purpose of acquiring every possible degree of power and of establishing their supremacy over the world, they, that is the popes, began these Western councils at Rome, where the Pope, by means of Italian influence, could generally have his own way. We shall see, however, that with all these advantages, slow progress was made toward papal infallibility. It took all of the time from 869 A.D. to 1870 A.D., 1,000 years, to find a general council with so little self-respect as to place the whole power of the Church in the hands of the Pope." So I characterized the papacy as a beggar yesterday on the program, and it is true. It has taken the Pope a period of no less than 1,000 years to finally find a council, a general council of the Roman Catholic Church that would acknowledge the Pope as infallible. Now I got to ask my listeners a question. How long do you think it'll take Christ Jesus, when he appears, to convince the world that he, not the Pope, is the infallible King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Will it take 1,000 years? Not hardly. All he's got to do is show up. Okay? All he's got to do is show up, and every eye will see, and every ear will hear, and every tongue will confess that he is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the Pope is a satanic counterfeit. Okay? That's when the truth will be revealed finally to the world. And no one will be able to question his infallibility and his all-powerful status. So, again, a side-by-side comparison between the true King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and this phony counterfeit. Though he was indeed recognized as infallible at the 1870 General Council of the Roman Catholic Church, the First Vatican Council it's called. Now, the author continues, we're on the first full paragraph, page 636. The First Council of Lateran, we're going back to recount some of these older councils, and that they did not acknowledge the infallibility or the divine status of the Pope. It says the First Council of Lateran, called the Ninth Ecumenical, met during the pontificate of Calixtus II, but made no enactment in reference to the power and jurisdiction of the Pope. It passed 22 canons having reference to other matters. The Second Council of the Lateran, under Innocent II, confined itself mainly to the regulation of discipline. Yes, they had a discipline problem among the clergy of this so-called Church of Christ. They had a terrible disciplinary problem, and as by the way, that disciplinary problem still exists today. You can't cure the Roman Catholic Church of a divine curse. Okay? Sexual impropriety has always distinguished and marked the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church, and it will until Christ returns. And if you want to know the reason for that divine curse, simply read Romans chapter 1. So, this council, the Second Council of the Lateran under Pope Innocent II, confined itself mainly to the regulation of discipline. There seems to have been, by this time, and I'll just say tongue-in-cheek, there has always been a necessity for providing, as it did, that priests who kept concubines should not hear Mass. And there's a law of the church that how can a priest soil his hands with a harlot and then serve Mass and touch the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ on the altar? You know, that's sacrilegious as far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned. But the priests have this insatiable desire to soil their hands with harlots. And it says, and with each other, by the way. And little boys and anyone else they can get their grubby satanic mitts on. And it says, but it also secured for them the immunity from public censure by subjecting to anathema those who should abuse the clergyman. In other words, the clergyman can abuse anybody they want, all right, as long as they don't get caught. You know, surely this council didn't have to deal publicly with the abuses of the priests unless they got caught. And they were caught and caught and caught. And it's simply by just simple public demand, the council had to rein in these amorous and pedophilic priests. And but by the same token, the council said that no one can abuse a priest, and you know, they're sacrosanct. So, and it's still the law of the church today. The civil powers cannot try a priest, not without the acquiescence of the Pope, at least. So, we had to discipline the priests, and then we had to protect them from public censure. That's the Second Council of the Lateran. Now, the Third Council of the Lateran, under Alexander III, was supposedly a reform council designed, quote, to reform a great number of abuses that had crept into the church, unquote, and also to condemn heresies. I have to ask the question, the obvious question, if it's truly the Church of Jesus Christ, the one holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church outside of which there is no salvation, why are they constantly having to reform the church? Anyway, by this time, the power of the papacy had nearly reached its culmination. And Alexander III was not the kind of pope to permit any abatement of it. Not one of the 12 popes between him and Gregory VII equaled him in ambition and strength of will, and not one among his predecessors were more fitted than he to prepare the way for those events which would soon transpire under Pope Innocent III. While this council asserted nothing in reference to the Pope's supremacy, it enacted 27 disciplinary canons. There you go with the discipline again. It enacted 27 disciplinary canons, some of which were pointed at existing abuses, and continual abuses, I'll add. It went somewhat further than that immediately preceding in the recognition of principles asserted in the false decretals. So here is where the false decretals were formally acknowledged as a part of the library of the bulls, or rather the canons of the church, the Roman Catholic canon law. They had to assemble the history of the decrees of the popes all the way to the beginning of the church. And much of that history was missing, so they had to fabricate it. And that's what they did. Now, it anathematized those laymen, quote, who exact duties and lay taxes on the churches and on the ecclesiastical persons, unquote, and those who should dare to, quote, summon clergymen before the judges, unquote, in the secular courts. See, it's a constant consideration of the Roman Catholic Church not to allow their priests to be subject to the civil power. Why? Because they're always committing crime. That's why the councils were so preoccupied with the disciplinary measures and to restate the immunity of the priests, because they had a discipline problem and they didn't want the civil power to know about it, didn't want the civil power to have any jurisdiction over it. Otherwise, all the priests would be in prison and there wouldn't be anybody to serve Jesus at the Mass. It's just simple as that. So where's the papal infallibility in that? Where is the holiness in the one holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church? It doesn't exist. It says it relaxed nothing whatever in the work of establishing papal supremacy, while it omitted any avowal of it. So here again, we have no presence of an established papal supremacy in these early councils. It says the practice of publishing what are called papal constitutions, along with proceedings of councils, seems, however, to have been then introduced. These consist of the briefs, bulls, and encyclical letters of the popes, wherein they assert their own supremacy and occasionally their infallibility. They were designed, of course, to maintain, quote, the immunities of the Church, unquote, by making the powers of the Pope in the government superior to all other. Okay? Making the power of the popes in its government superior to all others. And it says the object to be accomplished by their publication in this form was manifestly to give them a sort of consular sanction, in order that the Church might in the end be brought to the point of accepting them as of equal obligation with the canons of the councils. Let me just try to explain to your clearer in your mind what these papal constitutions are, these bulls and briefs and encyclicals. They are the papal equivalent of what we call today executive orders. Okay, you see the President of the United States acting like the Pope. The equivalent of the Roman Catholic General Councils is the legislative sessions of Congress. And when they get done doing their business, then the President steps in, just like the Pope does, and issues his bulls and encyclicals and briefs called executive orders. So you can see the parallel, that our government is a virtual shadow of the government of the Vatican. That's because the United States government is becoming Romanized. Okay, the New World Order is already in place, and the president acts like a king, not a president. And the Pope acts like a god and not a priest. And so this is how it goes. It says the object to be accomplished by their publication, these executive orders of the popes, these briefs, bulls, and encyclicals, was manifestly to give them a sort of consular sanction in order that the Church might, in the end, be brought to the point of accepting them as of equal obligation with the canons of the councils. And just like the executive orders become a matter of law, just like the legislation that goes through Congress. Now, the process was simple and the argument plain. The false decretals had furnished the claims of authority set up by the popes from Clement to Siricius, and these quote-unquote constitutions were such as the popes had made since then, and as they all claimed supremacy and infallibility, therefore they were supreme and infallible. Hence we find annexed to the proceedings of this council quote, a large collection of diverse constitutions of Alexander III and of the popes who preceded him, and consequently of those also who succeeded him, which are published as a sequel to this council. So here we are at this particular Vatican Council that added these false decrees, these pseudo-Isidorian decretals, this collection of assorted bulls, briefs, and encyclicals that were written from the earliest times of the church by the popes, collected into a book, and then added as an addendum to the official acts of this particular council. And this forms, again, for those just tuning in, these forged documents become the basis upon which Roman Catholic canon law is built. Now, the proceedings of the Fourth Lateran Council exhibit the unbounded ambition of Pope Innocent III, under whose pontificate it was held. There we find the celebrated Third Canon, which makes the persecution and extirpation of heretics a religious duty, which yet remains the law of the papacy. Okay, we've talked about this before, the Fourth Lateran Council. The Third Canon passed by that council makes it an item of religious faith that they must kill heretics. That is, anybody that's not Roman Catholic. And it still is the law of the papacy. And this, ladies and gentlemen, if you're new to this information, it's going to sound outrageous. But this third canon of the Fourth Lateran Council explains all the wars, because that's what war is now. Its true purpose is hidden under a cloak of politics. Okay, but the motive for the wars is religious, and the motive for the wars is to put into practice the canon, the third canon of this Fourth Lateran Council, to exterminate and to extirpate heretics. And it justifies crusades. And that's exactly what the United States is conducting in the Muslim world right now. They're extirpating the heretics in commensurate with the decree of this third canon of the Fourth Lateran Council. And it says, by this time the claim of supremacy made and so frequently repeated by the popes was considered to have the sanction of the church because there was no formidable resistance to it. In other words, they just passively acquiesced by not objecting. It says the acquiescence was inferred from silence. Pope Innocent III availed himself of this in order that the practice of asserting this claim in papal constitutions should become ripened into the force of law. He, accordingly, is the first pope who boldly and openly struck at the independence of a general council, and he was not accustomed to aim his blows inefficiently. 70 canons were passed without debate, which, quote, were already drawn up, unquote, by him when the council assembled at Rome. There was no deliberation or debate about them. They were laid before the council by the Pope, who ordered them to be read, but they were not acted upon. And it says, but because the prelates did not openly resist and denounce them, quote, their silence was taken for approbation or approval, unquote, a rule of procedure yet adhered to by the Roman Catholic Church. So the Pope just walked into the council, laid down his articles, his instructions, and simply ordered them to be read as if they were just being entered into the record as fact. No debate. You don't debate what the Pope says is law. You simply stamp your sign of approval to it. And that's what he expected of this council. And though there were probably numerous objections of this usurped power of the Pope as exerted upon this council, they just remained quiet about it and let it go. Okay, now the papacy used that as a precedent, that whenever the Pope walks into a council with his entourage wearing his pointy hat and his stick in his hand, and he carries a big book with him and he lays it down and just tells them to read it into the record, that they're not supposed to argue with it. They're just supposed to read it into the record as if it were law already passed and legislated. That's just the equivalent of the executive orders of the presidents of the United States today. They don't debate it. They don't pass it through Congress. They don't pass it before the American people. They just write it and read it into the record. Now it says, among these canons we find it avowed for the first time in the proceedings of a general council that, quote, the Church of Rome, unquote, has, quote, the primacy over all other churches according to the appointment of our Savior, unquote, that they all owe, quote, obedience to the Holy See, unquote, and that the pall received from Rome is the, quote, ensign of the plenitude of pastoral power, unquote. In other words, he carries the diadem. Okay? King of kings and Lord of lords. It says, this bold avowal was not made, therefore, till the 13th century, but even then, when the world was enveloped in the thick mist of the Middle Ages, it stopped somewhat short of the claim of the Pope's personal infallibility. Pope Innocent III was undoubtedly ready to carry it to that extent, but with all his daring, he was not prepared to ask of a general council a direct decree to that effect. It will be perceived that the primacy asserted was alleged to be in the Church of Rome, not in the Pope. It manifestly designed to consider the Church to be, according to the invariable custom, the whole body of the Christians, as represented by the universal episcopate in general council, and that the Pope, in asserting his primacy, should act within the limitations fixed by the Church. Otherwise, many of the canons would have been useless, especially the 44th. This canon solemnly declares, quote, that the constitutions of princes, in other words, the laws of the lands, which are prejudicial to the rights of the Roman Catholic Church, shall not be observed, whether they be for the alienation of fiefs, or for the encroachment on the ecclesiastical jurisdiction, or for any other goods, unquote. So in other words, any civil law that is in any way prejudicial against or detrimental to the rights and prerogatives of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church are, in a sense, null and void. No civil law can place a limitation either on the popes or the Church. And granted, this is the only church in the United States that arrogates to itself this power. And this power is used to convert this Protestant republic into a papal dictatorship. Now, there was a canon entered into Roman Catholic canon law, the law of the God of this world, that prohibited any secular power from instituting any law that is prejudicial or in any way limits the rights of the Pope or the Roman Catholic Church. And it said that such laws shall not be observed. And this is the power that the Roman Catholic Church has. It demands state sponsorship. It demands state recognition. It demands immunity from the state. It demands superiority over the state, which makes it a state-sponsored religion. It makes it the de facto religion of every nation. Okay? By papal decree, by Roman Catholic canon law. No other church has these privileges. No civil power would acknowledge such privilege from the other churches, but they have to. the Roman Catholic Church because they have so much power. This is why when a pedophile priest is brought in with the civil authorities, the papacy steps in and says, he's mine, I'll take care of that business. And the civil power is just simply dismissed. His jurisdiction is not held. And the pedophile priest pandemic in the world, it can't be touched by the civil power unless the people just simply rebel and demand that these priests be held accountable to the laws of the land and force the papacy and the priests to comply with civil law and to hell with their canon law. And that's what it's going to take to get justice over these pedophile priests. That's what it's going to take to get justice, to get the priests kicked out of the halls of Congress, to get them kicked out of the Supreme Court, to get them kicked out of the halls of the White House. Do you know, when you hear the rumor that President Barack Obama, and I hesitate to use the term president in association with his name because he's not a duly elected president, do you know what ought to pass through the minds of every American when it is heard that the Pope called Barack Obama and congratulated him on his election? Chills ought to run up and down your spine. The hair ought to stand up on the back of your neck. And if you comprehend what R.W. Thompson is asserting here, that's a right reaction. When the Pope calls to congratulate a president of the United States upon his election, because you know, carried with that congratulations is the demand that he uphold Roman Catholic canon law under his kingship. President of the United States is no longer a duly elected president. He's a papal king, and he operates like a papal king. This is part of the restoration of the old world order when the Pope ruled over the kings of the earth. Look, I've explained this before, but I think it's time to do it again. Who picks the candidates for president? Look, if Roman Catholic canon law says only the Pope can pick the kings, and we've got a nation, the United States of America, that says the people ought to elect their government officials, and Roman Catholic canon law says the people are not to govern, they are to be governed. They should have no say in the government. If the Pope can't stand up in Rome and say, the United States is apostate, we command the Roman Catholics of the country to overthrow the government and to reassert papal supremacy and the Roman Catholic hierarchy as the government of the land, and that the people are to be governed instead of to be the governors. How do you think the Pope, if he can't do that, how do you think his alternative means might be to achieve the same thing? Simply by picking all the candidates for president. Allow the people to go to the polls, pull the levers, and act like they've done something, when in fact all they've ever done is just select one of the two papal picks. The Pope doesn't care who you vote for, as long as he picks all the candidates. And that's exactly how the Pope gets obedience from the presidents of the United States. They're his candidates, not ours. We don't pick the candidates. Powers that be, hooded, frocked priests and their assigns pick the candidates for president. That's how they defeat civil law. That's how they defeat Congress. That's how they defeat the Supreme Court. That's how they defeat our Constitution, by putting their men in the highest offices of this land. And it's time for us to just admit what is taking place. The Pope will not be set aside, not even in the United States of America. He's taken advantage of our system. He knows how our system works, and he knows how to defeat it. And so do his Jesuit priests, his Knights of Malta, his Knights of Columbus, his Opus Dei, and all the other monks and nuns and this whole system called the shadow government of the Roman Catholic Church. They know how to operate within the system to achieve compliance with Roman Catholic canon law. That's what they do. Now, this council solemnly declared, quote, that the constitutions of princes, in other words, the Constitution of the United States, which are prejudicial to the rights of the Roman Catholic Church, shall not be observed, whether they be for the alienation of fiefs or for the encroachment on the ecclesiastical jurisdiction, that is, the Pope's jurisdiction, or of any other goods, unquote. If the council had intended to change the deposit of infallibility from themselves as representing the Church to the Pope alone, or if the Pope had thought it expedient to have his personal infallibility distinct from that of the council openly acknowledged, there would have been no necessity for this canon. The principle asserted in the canon was considered necessary to the Church, and as required the stamp of infallibility upon it, in order that it should stand throughout all time. To give it this, the consent of the council was necessary, and that not having been withheld, this canon is one of those which the present Pope is desirous of enforcing, and with reference to which the late council must be considered to have acted. The principal object of the First Council of Lyons, another council under Innocent IV, was to decree a general crusade. Okay, the Church can call a crusade, can go to war. Remember, the Roman Catholic Church calls itself the Church militant. And it says, although much may be inferred from its silence under the existing state of affairs, yet it made no decree about primacy, supremacy, or infallibility. It, however, gave its sanction to the bull of the popes which deposed the Emperor Frederick and released his subjects from their allegiance, from which it is fair to suppose that both the popes and the council considered this sanction as necessary to give that act the ratification of the Church. So the Pope has power to call crusades. He has power to dismiss kings. And if the king won't just voluntarily get up off of the throne and dismiss himself at the order of the Pope can simply call the people to rebel against the government and to absolve them from any oath of allegiance to that government, and to declare them all heretics if they don't extirpate the heretic that's sitting on the throne. See how this works? This is how you conquer the world. And that's the intent of all of it. But be that as it may, not yet, even at this first Council of Lyons, did it become a matter of the faith of the Roman Catholic Church to assent to papal infallibility. He says, be this as it may, the stamp of infallibility was also given in this mode to the right of deposing monarchs and releasing their subjects from their allegiance, and that principle, with the approbation of this council, took its place among the canons of the Church, where it has ever since remained. It's still a law of the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope can call a crusade and dismiss a king. Now, the Second Council of Lyons, under Gregory X, was called with reference chiefly to a reunion with the Greek Church. Okay, the two legs of iron. The Greek Church happens to be the Eastern iron leg, and they want to unite the two churches under this council. It says it dealt chiefly with a reunion of the Greek Church, which fact will sufficiently account for its silence in reference to papal infallibility and primacy, etc. In other words, the Eastern Church doesn't want to accept the Pope as infallible and divine. It has its own patriarchal, hierarchical system. And it says its doctrinal decrees had reference to the possession of the procession of the Holy Spirit, though it passed a number of a disciplinary character and upon general subjects. So here we go again with this disciplinary matter. And it continues now. The Council of Vienna, another one of these councils, was assembled under Clement V, This pope had reached the pontificate by a corrupt bargain with Philip, King of France, which we talked about in an earlier chapter, by which he solemnly pledged himself that if elected, he would cause Pope Boniface VIII to be declared infamous. How's that for papal infallibility, right? He was one of those who held the corrupt papal court at Avignon in France and who contributed his full share toward causing it to be esteemed the most prostituted place in Europe. So much so that Bishop Durandi said of it that it was the great retreat of dragons, the place of resort of satyrs, that is demons, and the kingdom of demons, unquote. Clement V called this council to avoid, if possible, the fulfillment of his promise to Philip, as he hoped to find shelter behind its unwillingness to defame a former pope. He succeeded so far as to pacify the king by issuing a bull to the effect that all the former bulls of Boniface VIII against him should be held void. The council did nothing but pass some canons concerning the faith and others condemning and anathematizing some heretics. With its proceedings, however, there were published a number of papal constitutions, here these executive orders by the Pope again, after the practice introduced by other popes, all tending to increase the power of the papacy. So again, we see the council not upholding papal infallibility, but the Pope simply issuing the executive order or a papal encyclical or a canon or a brief as an addendum to the council, asserting this infallible status of the Pope. The Pope's a beggar. This is what this demonstrates. And it says some of these by Clement V himself only go to show how entirely impossible it was for such a man to be infallible. It is scarcely possible that they could ever have been accepted by the Church, or that any general council would have allowed them a moment's consideration. Among those given by Dupin the historian are such as these. Listen to this. This is one of the decrees of this Pope. That as man may reach perfection in this life, when he has done so, he, quote, may merely allow his body what he pleases, unquote, that he is not then, quote, obliged to obey or tied to practice the principles of the Church, unquote. That when a man reaches perfection, he doesn't have to obey anybody or anything. Is that commensurate with the law of God? That when a man reaches perfection in this life, when he has done so, he may freely allow his body what he pleases. That he is not obliged to obey or tied to practice or the principles of the Church. Doesn't that define the papacy? They allow their bodies whatever they want. It's in all the papers what they want. Here's another one, quote, that to kiss a woman is a mortal sin, but the carnal knowledge of her is no sin, etc., etc. Do you see why many of the outrages of the papacy can't be spoken of in polite company? That in order to really talk about the deep, dark, demonic, satanic crimes of the Roman Catholic Church, you have to find just one person has slipped way out in the back 40 behind the barn to talk about it. That's why so much of the laws regarding human sexuality of the Roman Catholic Church is still written in Latin. You can't get it translated into the English. They don't want this slipping out, and it would just be a public outrage. It's too salacious to talk about. We've talked about a lot of things in this book. We've talked about one pope who had an incestuous relationship with his own mother, and one who had an incestuous relationship with his daughter and bore him a child, Lucretia Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. But there are yet things that this pope suggests in his bull, in his brief, that just simply cannot be talked about. He says once he achieves perfection in this life, he may freely allow his body what he pleases. In other words, he's under no restraint. None. He's reached perfection. The law is not necessary anymore. Common decency is not required anymore. How far do you think this depravity goes? And certainly, if we knew, we couldn't talk about it here on First Amendment Radio. I'd get thrown off the air. He's obliged to obey. He's not obliged to obey or tied to any principle or practice of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, these people have carte blanche permission to do whatever they wish. And even sitting in the palace at the Vatican and profess all these things about the Roman Catholic Church, he is immune from any of it. You talk about the epitome of hypocrisy. You can't get more hypocritical than this. He says further, to kiss a woman is a mortal sin, but to have carnal knowledge of her is no sin, etc., etc. This is just a hint as to what a perfected pope may freely allow his body to do as he pleases. Now, this latter papal precept was probably designed as a shield for his intercourse with the beautiful Countess de Foy. Yeah, he had a concubine, and he couldn't deny it. Too many people knew about it. So he just issued a papal brief that exonerated him. Is this the Church of Jesus Christ? Or is it, as I assert, and as all the Protestant reformers asserted, it's the Church of Antichrist? Now, this Council of Vienna was the 15th recognized as ecumenical, and the last which preceded that at Constance. Neither by any of its decrees nor by any of those assembled before it was there any direct averment to the effect that the Pope was infallible. With all of them, infallibility was lodged in the collective church and nowhere else. But so frequently had some of the most ambitious and pretentious popes endeavored to assert it for themselves, independently of the church, acting as an organized body, and by this means to enlarge the circle of their admitted spiritual primacy so as to make it broad enough to include jurisdiction over temporals, that it became absolutely necessary to the peace and welfare of the church that the Council of Constance should grapple directly with the question and put it to rest. It did endeavor to do so, as we've already seen, by deposing one pope and declaring the superiority of a general council over all of them. This was undoubtedly the voice of the church, declaring in the only recognized mode, as was accepted as such by all the popes themselves and their special adherents in Italy, where their power was omnipotent. They were not disposed to rest long under this direct censure of a general council, for even Martin V, who accepted from it the place of the deposed pope, so soon as he could get away from its immediate influence, commenced a series of measures designed expressively to reverse its decisions and to bring it into disrepute. In this he was sympathized with by Pope Eugenius IV, his immediate successor, under whose pontificate the Council of Florence was held, only 17 years after the Council of Constance. To this council we are now referred by all the defenders of papal infallibility, in proof that this doctrine has always been recognized by the Church as a part of the faith. From that time they trace it down to the present, through the councils of the Fifth Lateran and of the Council of Trent, to show that the late council, the Sixth Lateran, did not introduce any new dogma, but only gave expression to the faith which had always and everywhere existed. This pretense requires a minute examination, somewhat more in detail, but in order to see that it is a pretense and nothing more, it is only necessary to observe the manner in which the Jesuit writers dispose of the Council of Constance. Whether in doing this mendacity or ingenuity prevails the most, the reader must judge for himself. Passing by the equivocations of Wenninger, from whose book repeated quotations have already been made, and his flagrant suppression of important facts necessary to a correct understanding of the Council of Constance, let us come directly to the important points of his explanation. He says that in condemning the heresy of the Wycliffites, the council, quote, did not pronounce new ecclesiastical censures against them, but contented themselves with reminding the faithful that the sect and its infamous doctrines had been previously condemned by the decisions of the Holy See. These decisions are irrefragable, remarks the council, because it is impossible that the Apostolic See, that is to say, the Pope, should err, unquote. It requires but a moment's thought to see that it was impossible in the very nature of things for the Fathers of Constance to have stultified themselves by any such declaration as this. It would have been as diametrically opposed to what they actually did as darkness is to light. They had tried, condemned, and deposed Pope John the 23rd, a lawful pope, for innumerable crimes, including heresy, and to have followed such an act with an assertion that it was impossible for the pope to err would have made them the laughing stock of all Europe. So, in other words, this historian lied, as we've uncovered all along. This historian called Wenninger. He says, but it is not necessary to argue upon general principles to show how entirely this assertion of Wenninger is without any fact to support it. Dupin says the decree of the Council of Constance concerning the authority of the Council above the Pope did plainly decide the question and subjected the Pope, as well as to the faith as to manners, to the judgment of the General Council, which applied not only to the times of schism or where there were rival popes, but generally in all other cases, unquote. So even up to the time of this council, there was no decree of papal infallibility or supremacy. It was only at the First Vatican Council in 1870. We'll continue Monday on Inquisition Update.